Inside the holiest walls on earth, a young duke recovering from an assassination attempt lay in his bed. He wasn't murdered for politics, or for treason, or for any of the grand reasons that move kingdoms. He was strangled in that bed because his wife's brother couldn't bear to see her happy. Welcome. I'm truly glad you're here to explore this with me. This is one of those stories that, once you hear it, never really leaves you. Together, we are going to travel back to the year 1500, to a Rome glittering with Renaissance art and shadowed by breathtaking corruption. We are stepping directly into the private world of the most notorious family in history, the Borgias. This was not some crime of passion in a forgotten alleyway, its details lost to time. This murder took place under the Pope's own roof, with his tacit permission. The victim was Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisegli. The woman nursing him was his wife, the famous Lucrezia Borgia, and the man who orchestrated his death was Lucrezia's own brother, the brilliant and terrifying Cesare Borgia, a cardinal turned general, whose ambition was matched only by his possessiveness. Lucrezia herself is a figure we think we know, but the truth of her situation is far more tragic and far more human than the dark caricature of legend. So, I invite you to find a quiet space. Allow the noise of the modern world to fade away. There is no need to rush through this tale. We will move at the pace of history itself, taking our time to listen to the echoes in the stone and to understand not just the clinical facts of what happened, but the tangled human emotions that made it inevitable. Because this is so much more than a 500-year-old murder mystery. It is a profound exploration of power and family. It's a story about how, in certain families, loyalty becomes a form of control, and love becomes the most dangerous vulnerability one can have. We are going to trace the precise chain of events that led a powerful dynasty to sacrifice one daughter's happiness for a son's grand design, and in doing so, cement a legacy of darkness that still fascinates and horrifies us today. To do that, we have to confront some difficult and intimate questions. At what point does a brother's protective love twist into a destructive, suffocating possession? How could a pope, a man considered God's representative on earth, knowingly allow a cold-blooded murder to take place within the sacred walls of his own home? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, what became of Lucrezia Borgia, the brilliant, beautiful woman trapped between the husband she had grown to love and the brother she could neither defy nor escape? Let us go back just 2 years, to 1498. Let us see this marriage not as a historical footnote, but as a human reality. Lucrezia Borgia, then just 18, was marrying for the second time, a pawn in her father's grand dynastic game. Her husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was handsome, noble, and by all accounts, kind. Against all odds, it seems they found a genuine affection for one another, a rare thing in a purely political union. Their life together in Rome was, for a brief, sunlit time, a small island of private joy away from the Vatican's plotting. But the political tides that had brought them together were already beginning to turn. The alliance with Alfonso's family, once crucial, was rapidly becoming a liability. For her brother Cesare, it was more than a liability. It had become an obstacle he was determined to remove. Before the bloodstains, there was gold. To understand the murder of Alfonso of Aragon, we must first walk the streets of Borgia, Rome, a city where faith and fear were two sides of the same coin, minted by one family. Let us explore the city they ruled. Rome, at the turn of the 16th century, was a breathtaking contradiction, a place of divine ambition and earthly squalor. Imagine the sounds. You would hear the chime of 1,000 church bells calling the faithful to prayer, their holy echo mingling with the rumble of ox carts dragging marble from the guts of the Colosseum. New basilicas, monuments to the glory of God and the ego of the Pope, rose into the sky, their gleaming domes scraping against a history of pagan ruins. The air itself was a complex tapestry, thick with the scent of beeswax and incense pouring from open church doors. But just beneath it was a heavier smell, the odour of sewage and river mud, and the press of too many unwashed bodies, a constant reminder of the city's mortal reality. This was a city on a knife's edge. It was a place where pilgrims came to find salvation, but where assassins found steady work. And presiding over all of it from the newly renovated Apostolic Palace in the Vatican, was one man. He was the source of both its splendor and its terror. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, but the world knew him as Pope Alexander VI. He was not a man of quiet contemplation or spiritual purity. Alexander was a force of nature, a Catalan with boundless energy, overwhelming charm, and an ambition that recognized no earthly or divine limit. He had bought the papacy through staggering bribery, a fact that was an open secret in Rome. But once he had the throne of St. Peter, he treated it not as a sacred trust, but as an inheritance for his children. He saw the Italian peninsula as a chessboard, and the Papal States as a kingdom to be carved out and secured for his own bloodline. Historians generally agree he was a masterful administrator and a shrewd diplomat. He was also a man who loved power, loved luxury, and most of all, loved his family with a fierce and enabling passion. The Church had rules against priests having children, but Alexander had at least 4 he openly adored and promoted. They were his obsession, his legacy, and the instruments of his will. His papacy was not for God, it was for them, and for one son in particular. That son was Cesare Borgia. In the year 1498, Cesare was still a cardinal, an office his father had bestowed upon him as a teenager. But he was a prince of the Church who yearned to be a prince of the world. Cesare was restless in his crimson robes. He possessed a terrifying intellect, a warrior's spirit, and a charisma that could bend men to his will. He was famously handsome, but it was a cold, watchful beauty. People who met him spoke of his unnerving stillness, the feeling that he was constantly calculating, assessing, and judging. He moved through the Vatican's corridors not as a servant of God, but as its heir apparent. He was his father's enforcer, his chief strategist, and the sharpened edge of the family's ambition. While the Pope managed the politics from his throne, Cesare was the one who would ride into the field and conquer the lands they coveted. It seems almost certain that he viewed the world in simple terms, things that helped the Borgia family and things that stood in their way. Anything, or anyone, in that second category was disposable. The great project of his life was to forge a kingdom. He would need armies, he would need land, and he would need his family's unwavering loyalty. But his strategy depended entirely on the third member of their trinity, his sister, Lucrezia. If Cesare was the family's sword, Lucrezia was its treasure. By all contemporary accounts, she was extraordinarily beautiful, with long golden hair that became legendary. But she was more than just a pretty face. The letters she left behind reveal a sharp, intelligent woman, fluent in several languages, with a deep appreciation for art and music. Yet in the world of the Borgias, her gifts were secondary to her function. She was the ultimate political tool, a beautiful bride whose hand in marriage could seal a crucial alliance, secure a border, or win a powerful friend. Her happiness was never the primary consideration. Her first marriage, at age 13, was annulled on humiliating terms when her husband's family fell out of favor with her father. Lucrezia was merely a piece to be moved on the board, returned to the box when her purpose was served. She had been raised in a world where love was irrelevant and loyalty to the family was everything. This was the only life she had ever known. She existed to serve the ambitions of her father and, increasingly, the grand designs of her brother Cesare. Her duty was to marry whomever they told her to marry. The personal cost was of no concern to them. Together, these three, the Pope, the General, and the bride, formed a unit of terrifying efficiency. They created a new kind of court, one built on pure nepotism. Alexander made dozens of cardinals, packing the sacred college with Spanish loyalists who owed him everything. Key positions in the Papal States were given to Borgia cousins and allies. This ensured that every lever of power, from the church treasury to the papal army, was in the hands of someone who answered directly to them. This network of loyalty created a shield of impunity around the family. Whispers followed them everywhere, dark rumors of rivals who had dinner with the Pope and fell ill the next day. The Borgia name became synonymous with the specific poison, cantarella, an arsenic compound said to be their favorite tool. We have to pause and wonder how much of this was exaggerated by their many enemies, and how much was grim reality, but the fear was real. It created an atmosphere where no one dared to cross them openly. Disobedience wasn't just punished, it was erased, often quietly and always permanently. They did not just bend the rules of the papacy, they shattered them. For centuries, the Pope was meant to be a spiritual father, above the grubby business of dynasty and inheritance. Alexander and Cesare transformed the office into something else entirely. They were building a hereditary monarchy under the cover of the Catholic Church. Sin was no longer a moral failing, it was a political instrument. Greed secured power, lust created heirs, and murder removed obstacles. By making the papacy a family enterprise, they placed themselves outside the normal constraints of law and even theology. When the Pope himself sanctions your actions, who is left to condemn you? Who can declare your ambition a sin when the Vicar of Christ declares it a holy necessity? This belief that they were exceptional, that they were chosen not by God but by destiny to forge a new order, was the most dangerous idea of all. It gave them permission to do anything. To truly understand this world, it helps to place ourselves in the shoes of someone who had to navigate it. Perhaps a cardinal, sitting in a consistory meeting. You would bow low to Pope Alexander, smiling as you complimented his latest artistic commission. But you would feel the weight of his son's gaze from across the room. Every word you spoke would be a calculation. An alliance offered today could be a death sentence tomorrow. You would listen to Cesare's quiet, confident voice outlining a new military campaign, and a knot would tighten in your stomach because you knew that the funds for that campaign would be raised by seizing the property of another cardinal who had recently, and conveniently, died. This was not a court of faith. It was a labyrinth of survival. You would watch Lucrezia, the Pope's beloved daughter, and perhaps feel a moment of pity for her gilded cage. But you would never, ever voice it. Because in Borgia Rome, compassion was a weakness, and survival depended on seeing everything, saying little, and siding with the power that was absolute. This perfect machine of power, this family unit welded together by ambition and fear, seemed utterly unstoppable. But it had a vulnerability, a single point of failure that no one, least of all they, could have predicted. A new marriage for Lucrezia, designed to secure their southern flank, was about to introduce an element they couldn't entirely control. That element was genuine, human love. How would this family, built on cold calculation, react to something so beautifully and dangerously unpredictable? And so, into this gilded cage of power and paranoia, walked a handsome young duke from Naples, Alfonso of Aragon. He was meant to be another pawn in their great game, another temporary piece on the board, but he would become something far more dangerous to their plans. He would become family. The man who arrived in Rome to marry Lucrezia Borgia was 17 years old, the illegitimate son of a king, and by every account, impossibly handsome. His name was Alfonso of Aragon, and he was the Duke of Bisegli, a title connected to the powerful kingdom of Naples. He carried with him the weight of an old and respected royal house, a stark contrast to the Borgias' raw, newly acquired power. He was a piece in a political puzzle, a human link designed to secure the Pope's southern border. It was a standard dynastic arrangement, but from the moment he entered the city, it was clear that this union might become something more complicated. He was charming, he was cultured, and he was not afraid. The wedding itself, in the summer of 1498, was a declaration of Borgia dominance. Let's trace the sound and feel of that day inside the Vatican. Imagine the whisper of silk and velvet as cardinals and ambassadors moved through the frescoed halls, their faces composed into masks of polite congratulation. The air would have been heavy with expensive perfumes struggling against the summer heat and the smoke from hundreds of beeswax candles. You would hear the solemn drone of a Latin Mass, the words echoing in a space built for God but being used, at that moment, for the strategic advantage of a single family. It was a performance of piety and power, a transaction dressed in the robes of a holy sacrament, and at the centre of it all stood an 18-year-old girl. This was Lucrezia's second time at the altar, and she might have felt a deep weariness, a sense that her life was a series of ceremonies orchestrated by others. But then, she might have looked at her new husband. Alfonso was not an old, bitter political ally. He was a young man of her own age, celebrated for his grace and kindness. Here, we must pause and try to see the world through her eyes. For the first time, perhaps, the political necessity of her marriage aligned with the possibility of personal happiness. This was not just a duke, this was a chance. It's easy to imagine a flicker of genuine hope igniting within her, the idea that she could be more than just a Borgia, that she could be a wife and build a life of her own. For nearly 2 years, that hope seemed to become a reality. Lucrezia and Alfonso settled into a life in Rome that was, by all appearances, genuinely happy. Contemporary diarists noted that the two were inseparable. They were a young, attractive, and powerful couple, and Lucrezia, for the first time, seemed to be truly flourishing. She was no longer just the Pope's daughter, she was the Duchess of Bisegli, a respected noblewoman with a husband who adored her. They created a small court of their own, filled with musicians and poets, a space that must have felt like a refuge from the constant scheming of her father's palace. In November of 1499, their happiness seemed to be cemented forever. Lucrezia gave birth to a son, whom they named Rodrigo, after her father. This small family unit represented a new phase in Lucrezia's life. It was a private world, built on affection and shared moments, a quiet island in the middle of a churning political sea. It seems she had found a measure of peace. She had fulfilled her duty by providing an heir, and in the process had found a companion she truly cared for. But the very foundation of their happiness was political quicksand. The alliance with Naples, the entire reason for her marriage to Alfonso, had been her father's strategy. But her father's strategy was rapidly becoming secondary to her brother's ambition. While Lucrezia was building a nursery, Cesare was building an army, and his gaze was fixed not on Naples to the south but on France to the north. A new grand plan was taking shape in Cesare's mind. This plan required a new set of alliances. The old ones were not just useless, they were now in the way. While a small, fragile happiness bloomed in Lucrezia's private apartments, a storm was gathering in her brother's mind. Cesare's ambition had outgrown Rome. It had outgrown the church. His gaze was now fixed on the north, on the glittering, powerful court of France, and he was formulating a plan that would reshape the destiny of Italy. This plan had no room for a Neapolitan duke. It had no room for his sister's quiet life. For Cesare, his sister's contentment was not a source of joy. It was a strategic inconvenience. But here's where it gets complicated. To build a kingdom, Cesare needed more than his father's blessing. He needed a title recognized by the old monarchies of Europe, a high-born wife to legitimize his dynasty, and most importantly, he needed a professional army. Pope Alexander's papal forces were not enough for the scale of conquest he envisioned. There was only one man who could give him all three of these things. That man was the new King of France, Louis XII. A deal was about to be struck, a pact that would change the map of Italy and seal Alfonso's fate. The French king had his own pressing needs. He desperately wanted the Pope to grant him an annulment from his wife so he could marry another, securing the valuable Duchy of Brittany for the French crown. It was a blatant political move, and only the Pope had the authority to sanction it. Alexander and Cesare saw their opportunity, and they did not hesitate. The Pope's moral authority would be traded for a son's secular power, a holy decree, in exchange for soldiers and steel. This was the cold currency of the Borgia enterprise. The first public sign of this cataclysmic shift came in August of 1498. In a secret meeting of cardinals, Cesare Borgia, at the age of 23, stood before his father and did the unthinkable. He resigned from the clergy. He cast off the crimson robes of a cardinal, the very symbol of his power in the church, declaring he had been forced into a spiritual life against his true nature. The act was pure political theatre, a stunning public declaration that he was finished with the games of the Vatican. He was ready for the games of war. He was no longer a prince of the church. He was now, simply, a prince. This single act sent a shockwave across the courts of Europe. It was a clear signal that the Borgias were making a major pivot. To understand its gravity, think of the political landscape of Italy as a tense chessboard. For years the Pope had played a careful game, balancing the power of France against the power of Spain and its allies in Naples. Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso of Aragon was a key move, placing a Borgia piece firmly in the Neapolitan camp. But now, Cesare had decided to flip the entire board. By allying with France, he was openly siding with Naples' mortal enemy. Suddenly, Alfonso was no longer a friendly piece. He was a rival king's rook, inexplicably left standing in the middle of the Borgia back rank. It did not matter that he was a good husband. It did not matter that he was the father of the Pope's grandson. All that mattered was what his name represented. Aragon, Naples, Spain, the old alliance. The alliance that now stood directly in the way of Cesare's new and far grander ambition. In the new world Cesare was building, Alfonso was a relic of a dead strategy, and relics are meant to be cleared away. It's a pattern of ruthless calculus that is depressingly timeless. Consider a modern corporate merger, where two rival companies join forces. Suddenly, entire departments are made redundant. Loyal, effective executives, who were experts in competing against the new partner, become liabilities overnight. They represent a past that is no longer convenient. Their personal qualities become irrelevant. They are collateral damage in service of a new, forward-looking strategy. For Cesare, Alfonso of Aragon was precisely that. He was human collateral damage. We can see the consequences of this new alliance almost immediately. Just a few months after shedding his cardinal's robes, Cesare rode to France in a procession of almost unimaginable wealth, a display designed to announce the arrival of a new European power player. There, King Louis made good on his promises. He granted Cesare the French Duchy of Valentinois, which gave him the nickname he would carry for the rest of his life, Il Valentino. He also gave Cesare a royal bride, a princess related to the French throne, and crucially, he promised him French troops for his upcoming campaign to carve out his own kingdom in the Romagna region of Italy. The French army was soon on the march. The alliance was no longer a secret diplomatic agreement. It was a physical reality, a force of thousands of soldiers moving down the Italian peninsula. Their stated goal was the conquest of Milan, but everyone knew their ultimate target was Naples, Alfonso's home. The threat was now explicit. The Borgias had formally allied themselves with the very power that sought to destroy Lucrezia's family, and her husband, the living symbol of that family, was still living in the heart of the Vatican, sleeping just rooms away from the men who had sanctioned his ruin. He was a walking political embarrassment, a constant, living reminder of a promise they had broken. It seems almost certain that Alfonso felt the temperature in Rome begin to drop. The warm welcome he had once enjoyed would have evaporated, replaced by cold shoulders and averted eyes in the Vatican's corridors. Conversations would halt when he entered a room. Doors that were once open would now be closed. Perhaps he saw the way his brother-in-law now looked at him, no longer with the polite indifference of a courtier, but with the flat, assessing gaze of a general studying a problem on a map. His only protection, his only true ally within those sacred, treacherous walls, was his wife. Lucrezia's love was the one variable Cesare could not easily control. It was the only thing standing between her husband and the brutal logic of her brother's ambition. Cesare had a kingdom to win. He had the full backing of the French king and the limitless resources of the papacy. He had an army waiting for his command. He had only one problem left to solve, one piece from the old game that needed to be swept from the board before the new one could begin. How do you dispose of a political liability when he is sleeping in your sister's bed, right down the hall? The political calculus was cold and clear. Alfonso of Aragon was a problem that needed to be solved, but the solution was complicated by the simple fact that Lucrezia was happy. Her joy was a human shield around her husband, a defense that could not be breached by simple logic or papal decree. To remove Alfonso would require something more than a strategic decision. It would require a profound act of cruelty, one that would deliberately destroy his sister's world. This was a line even the Borgias had not yet crossed, but Cesare was already walking towards it. Here, we have to pause and wonder about the true nature of the bond between this brother and sister. It is the dark heart of this entire story. The relationship between Cesare and Lucrezia was famously, and perhaps infamously, close. Rumors of incest followed them their entire lives, whispers that echoed through the courts of Italy and have stained their legacy for 500 years. There is no concrete evidence that these rumors were true. It's more likely they were a form of political slander, a way for their enemies to paint the Borgias as monstrous and unnatural. But the rumors existed for a reason. They grew out of the undeniable intensity of Cesare's feelings for his sister, an attachment that seemed to go far beyond ordinary fraternal affection. It seems almost certain that Cesare viewed Lucrezia not as a sibling, but as a possession. She was the most beautiful and valuable thing the Borgia family had produced, and therefore she belonged to him. Not in a romantic sense, necessarily, but in a deeper, more absolute way. She was an extension of his own will, a reflection of his own glory. He had overseen her education, approved her companions, and directed her purpose. Her existence was interwoven with his grand design. This was not love, as we understand it. It was a form of ownership, as profound and unyielding as his ownership of a fortress or a title. He had given her to Alfonso as a temporary loan. He never intended for her to truly leave the family's orbit. Now, for a moment, let's try to see the world through Cesare's eyes. This requires us to set aside our modern morality and step into the mindset of a Renaissance prince for whom power was the only virtue. You are Cesare Borgia. You have renounced God's kingdom for an earthly one. You are forging a dynasty from nothing but ambition and your father's power. Every person around you is either a tool or an obstacle. There is no middle ground. Your sister is the most refined tool you possess. Her beauty secures alliances. Her obedience guarantees your influence. She is a part of the great machine you are building. And now, you see this machine developing a will of its own. You see your sister, your asset, pouring her energy and her loyalty into a Neapolitan prince. You watch her laugh with him. You see her hold their child, a new life that ties her more deeply to his foreign family than to yours. She is building a separate world, a world where you are not the center. This is not merely a personal slight. It is a strategic disaster. Her affection is a resource, and she is giving it to the enemy. Her loyalty is a currency, and she is spending it on a man who represents a failed policy. From this perspective, her happiness is not a blessing. It is a rebellion. It is a malfunction in the machine that must be corrected, quickly and permanently. This obsessive need for control was likely amplified by a secret he was desperately trying to hide. While Cesare was projecting an image of invincible will and physical perfection, his body was beginning to betray him. Historians generally agree that by this time, Cesare was suffering from an advanced stage of syphilis. It was a disease that carried an immense stigma, but its effects were more than social. It was a physically wasting illness, causing fevers, rashes, and eventually disfiguring facial lesions that he would later cover with a mask. We must consider the psychological toll this took on a man whose identity was built on power and physical dominance. Let's explore the sensory reality of his life at this moment. Imagine him in his private chambers in the Vatican late at night. You might hear the distant sound of a guard's armor clinking on the stone floors, or the hoot of an owl in the gardens below, but the loudest sound would be internal. The faint ringing in his ears, the dull ache in his bones, the heat of a low-grade fever that never quite broke. He might look into a polished silver mirror and see the first subtle signs of the disease on his skin, a flaw in the perfect facade he presented to the world. He was a man whose ambition was infinite, trapped inside a body that was beginning to fail, and just a few corridors away, his sister was sharing a bed with a husband who was the picture of youth, health, and effortless aristocratic grace. Alfonso was everything Cesare was starting to lose. This contrast must have been a constant private torture. Alfonso's existence was an insult. His physical beauty was a mockery of Cesare's hidden illness. His easy happiness with Lucrezia was a reminder of a simple human connection that Cesare, in his relentless pursuit of power, could never have. Jealousy is too simple a word. It was something deeper, a form of existential resentment. Alfonso had, without trying, obtained the one thing Cesare could not command, his sister's genuine, freely given devotion, and he was a living symbol of a future for Lucrezia that did not involve Cesare. This personal animosity soon began to bleed into the open. In the summer of 1500, during the great Jubilee year that filled Rome with pilgrims, the tension became unbearable. One evening, Lucrezia and Alfonso were talking with a papal official on the grand steps of St. Peter's Basilica. As dusk fell, a group of armed men, their faces hidden, rushed out of the shadows. They were not common thugs. They moved with professional precision. They ignored everyone else and focused solely on Alfonso, stabbing him multiple times before melting back into the city's labyrinthine streets. It was a brutal, public, and yet strangely theatrical attack. It was not designed to be a clean assassination. It was a message. Alfonso was gravely wounded, stabbed in the neck, shoulder, and leg, but he was alive. Guards carried his bleeding body back to his and Lucrezia's apartments in the Vatican, turning their home into a fortified hospital. Lucrezia was thrown into a state of terrified panic. Her idyllic life was shattered. The political games of her family were no longer a distant abstraction. They had come to her door with a bloody knife. She now understood, with chilling clarity, that her husband was a marked man, and she knew exactly who had marked him. One contemporary diarist reports that as Alfonso was being carried inside, Cesare's own voice was heard from the shadows, remarking coldly that what is not done at dinner can be done at supper. The meaning was unmistakable. The first attempt had failed. There would be another. The threat was not from some distant political enemy in Naples or Milan. The threat was inside the house. The threat was her brother. Cesare's rage at Alfonso's survival was reportedly immense. He had wanted a clean removal, and instead he had a messy, ongoing crisis. Alfonso was now under Lucrezia's direct protection, within the very walls of the apostolic palace. This changed the entire dynamic. It was no longer a political problem to be solved in the shadows of the city. It had become an intimate family drama, playing out in a single, guarded room. For Cesare, this was an intolerable situation. His target was being nursed back to health by the very person whose loyalty he was trying to reclaim. He saw his sister's care for her husband not as an act of love, but as an act of defiance. Every measure she took to save Alfonso's life was a direct challenge to his own authority. Her love wasn't just a romance. It was a transfer of allegiance, the one thing he could not, and would not, tolerate. July 15th. In the year 1500, the sun was setting over Rome, bleeding colours across a sky, hazy with summer heat and the dust of 1,000,000 pilgrims. Let us place ourselves in that specific evening air. It would have felt heavy, warm, and alive with the sounds of the Jubilee. You would hear the murmur of countless prayers in dozens of languages, the shuffling feet of the faithful, the distant calls of street vendors closing their stalls for the night. And on the wide, magnificent stone steps leading up to the great Basilica of St. Peter, a young duke was walking beside his wife, leaving the cool marble of the church for the warmth of the evening. The conversation was likely light, the kind of easy talk shared between two people who have found comfort in one another's company. It began with a rush of movement from the colonnade, a sudden violent disturbance in the placid rhythm of the evening. It was not a robbery. The men were cloaked, their purpose singular and terrifyingly clear. You would have heard the gasp of the crowd first, a collective intake of breath just before the chaos erupted. Then, the sharp, ugly sound of unsheathed steel slicing through the thick air. The attack was a blur of focused brutality. There were grunts of effort, the sickening thud of a pommel against bone, and the sharp, wet sound of blades finding their mark. Alfonso of Aragon likely had no time to even call out his wife's name. There was only the sudden, shocking impact, a constellation of searing pain that exploded in his head, his shoulder, his thigh. He fell to the stone, the holy ground beneath him instantly warm and slick with his own blood. The assassins were disciplined. They did not linger. They struck and then vanished back into the twilight, swallowed by the same shadows that had birthed them. For a few heartbeats, there was only a stunned, horrified silence. The pilgrims and officials who had witnessed the assault were frozen, caught between the sanctity of the place and the savagery of the act. The air, just moments before filled with the scent of incense and warm stone, was now tainted with the coppery tang of fresh blood. The attack was over in less than a minute. The message, however, had only just begun to be delivered. The first strike had been made, not in some dark alley, but in the very heart of Christendom. In that frozen moment of shock, it was Lucrezia who moved. Her scream must have torn through the twilight stillness, a sound of pure, undiluted terror. But her horror immediately calcified into something harder, something fiercely protective. We can almost see her, her fine silk dress stained, kneeling on the stone beside her husband's broken body. She would have been giving frantic orders, her voice sharp with an authority that few had ever heard from her. She was no longer a political bride or a pope's daughter. She was a wife fighting for her husband's life. She directed the papal guards, who had conveniently appeared only after the assassins had fled, to lift him. Carefully, they carried the bleeding duke away from the horrified public gaze, back through the bronze doors of the apostolic palace. They took him not to some anonymous physician's chamber, but to the Borgia apartments themselves, to a room in the tower directly above the Pope's own. Every step of that journey would have been a torment, leaving a trail of blood on the polished marble floors and priceless tapestries. The palace, a symbol of her family's absolute power, had now become a prison and a potential tomb. The home she had shared with him, the small island of happiness she had built, had been breached. The violence of the outside world, the violence of her brother's ambition, was now inside, breathing in the same air, staining the very floors she walked upon. She knew, it seems almost certain, that this was not a random act of violence. This was a signature. The days and nights that followed blurred into a long, suffocating vigil. Let us move from the public horror of the attack to the private agony of the sick room. The space would have been dim, the heavy summer air barely stirred by a breeze through the shuttered windows. The dominant sounds would have been the low, pained moans from the bed, the quiet rustle of linen being changed, and the soft clink of medical instruments. The air would be thick with the smells of the sick-room herbal poultices, vinegar used for cleaning, and the ever-present cloying scent of blood and infection. This was the new reality Lucrezia inhabited, a world shrunk to the size of a single room, its horizon defined by the shallow breathing of her dying husband. Alfonso lingered between life and death. The wounds were horrific. One blade had pierced his shoulder, another had sliced open his thigh, and a third, the most dangerous, had been driven into the side of his neck. He was consumed by fever, drifting in and out of consciousness. The physicians of the age did what they could, which was often more harmful than helpful. They bled him to weaken the fever, they packed the wounds with crude dressings, and they offered prayers. His survival, day after day, was considered a miracle, a testament to his youth and strong constitution, but every moment he remained alive was a moment of profound danger. Lucrezia's devotion transformed into a state of siege. She understood that the assassins had failed once but would undoubtedly try again. She took control of his care with a fierce, desperate resolve. It's reported that she slept in a small cot beside his bed, refusing to leave his side for more than a few moments. She barred the door to all but the most trusted servants. More than that, she took on a grim and terrifying responsibility. Fearing poison, the Borgia family's favoured tool, she prepared all of his food herself in their own small kitchen and had his own loyal servants taste it before she would allow him a single bite. She was his nurse, his guard, his cook, and his food taster. She had turned their bedroom into a fortress, a last bastion of defiance against her own family. Think of the psychological pressure on this 20-year-old woman. Every knock on the door would have sent a jolt of fear through her. Every new face, even that of a servant, would be scrutinized for any sign of treachery. She was living in a state of constant, heightened vigilance, fighting a two-front war, one against the infections raging in her husband's body, and another against the unseen threat that lurked just outside their chamber door. This was not the timid, passive pawn of legend. This was a woman of incredible courage, using the only power she had, her physical presence and her royal status, to protect the man she loved. Of course, the Pope, her father, had to make a show of outrage. Pope Alexander VI was a master of political theatre. He publicly condemned the cowardly attack, decrying the lack of security in his own city during the Holy Year. He appointed a commission, led by the governor of Rome, to investigate the crime and bring the perpetrators to justice. It was a magnificent performance. Guards were dispatched to search the city. Witnesses were questioned. Proclamations were read. But it was all a charade. The investigation yielded no suspects. No one was arrested. The commission quietly faded away, its purpose served. The Pope had demonstrated his official disapproval, and that was all that mattered. The truth was an inconvenience that everyone in the Vatican understood was best left undisturbed. During this time, Cesare Borgia made his own visit to the sick room. We can only speculate about the atmosphere when he entered that small, tense space. He would have moved with his characteristic stillness, his gaze taking in the scene, the pale, bandaged form of his rival in the bed, and his sister, her face drawn and exhausted, standing guard. Contemporary accounts state that Lucrezia met his gaze directly, her fear mixed with a new, cold anger. She accused him, not directly, but with a fury that left no room for doubt. She told him that if he had done this, he would live to regret it. Cesare's response was not one of denial. It was a chilling expression of his own twisted logic. He is said to have replied that he had not harmed the Duke, but that the Duke was a traitor, plotting against France and therefore against the Borgias. He was reframing the assassination attempt not as a murder, but as a political necessity, an act of state. He then, reportedly, turned his attention to Alfonso's Neapolitan doctors. He remarked that the patient's blood was of poor quality and that his physicians were incompetent. The threat was veiled, but perfectly clear. He was displeased with Alfonso's recovery. He was critiquing the very fact of his survival. Cesare's frustration was palpable. The failed attack was a stain on his reputation for ruthless efficiency. It had created a political soap opera inside the Vatican, with his own sister as the star actress, generating sympathy for his intended victim. This messy, prolonged situation was intolerable. The problem had not been solved. It had only been contained. For a man like Cesare, a man of absolute will, this was a personal and professional failure that demanded correction. For 33 days, the standoff continued. 33 days of Lucrezia's desperate nursing, of Alfonso's slow, agonizing recovery, of Cesare's simmering rage. The fortress Lucrezia had built around her husband seemed to be holding. Perhaps, in the quiet of those long nights, she allowed herself to hope. Perhaps she believed that if Alfonso could just regain his strength, she could spirit him away from Rome, back to the relative safety of Naples. She may have felt that her love and defiance had won, that she had stared down her terrifying brother and forced him to retreat. She had proven that her husband was not some disposable pawn. She had made him untouchable, but she had misunderstood the nature of the first attack. Its very public stage, on the steps of St. Peter's, was not a clumsy error. It was a declaration of principle. The choice of location was deliberate, designed to inspire the maximum amount of terror and awe. The message was not just for Alfonso, it was for every cardinal, every ambassador, every nobleman in Rome. It said that there is no sanctuary. It said that even God's own house cannot protect you from the will of the Borgias. The attack wasn't a failure because its target survived. Its true purpose had been achieved the moment the first blade was drawn. It established that a man could be struck down with impunity at the threshold of the most sacred place on earth. It was a demonstration that power, not piety, was the ultimate authority in Rome. And now, the final act of that demonstration was simply waiting for the right moment. For more than a month, that small room in the Borgia Tower became a sovereign state, a tiny kingdom of care ruled by a 20-year-old duchess. Lucrezia Borgia, who had been a political instrument her whole life, was now a general defending a fortress of one. She barricaded the door, allowing only 2 people inside, Alfonso's uncle and a trusted Neapolitan captain. She did this knowing the enemy was not outside the Vatican walls, but just down the corridor. Every footstep in the hall was a potential threat. 16 guards of her own choosing stood watch in shifts, their loyalty sworn to her, not to the Pope, and not to her brother. If you were one of those men, you would have felt the immense, terrifying weight of her trust. You would stand for hours in the stifling August heat, listening to the muffled sounds from within the chamber. You would hear not the orders of a duchess, but the quiet, constant work of a nurse. Her actions became a legend whispered among the palace staff. She dismissed the papal physicians, relying instead on doctors brought from Naples, men loyal to Alfonso's family. They worked tirelessly, but Lucrezia supervised their every move. She personally changed her husband's bandages, cleaned his wounds, and sat with him through the long, humid Roman nights. She would have listened to the sound of his shallow breathing, a fragile rhythm against the silence of the vast palace. This dedication was a silent, powerful accusation directed at her own blood. She fought the invisible war as well. Fearing poison, a threat that was always present in her family's house, she had a small stove brought into the antechamber. There, she prepared every meal for Alfonso herself. You, as that guard, would have seen her taste every single dish, every spoonful of broth, every sip of wine before it passed her husband's lips. It was an act of profound love and an act of open defiance. Each meal she prepared was a declaration that she knew exactly who her family was, and for a time, it seemed her defiance was working. Alfonso did not die. Against all odds, the fever receded and the wounds began to slowly heal. He began to speak again, his voice weak but coherent. There must have been moments of fragile, breathless hope inside that fortified room. Perhaps they talked of Naples, of a life away from the suffocating danger of Rome. We can imagine her plotting a secret escape, a desperate plan to smuggle her recovering husband out of the city and back to his own kingdom. The thought that they might actually survive this must have felt like a miracle. This tiny island of hope was a stark contrast to the life they had known just weeks before. The memory of their court, filled with the sound of lutes and recited poetry, must have felt like a dream from another life. Now the only sounds were whispered prayers and the clink of a spoon against a bowl. The scent of her perfume had been replaced by the smell of medicinal herbs and sickness. She was witnessing what happened when a small, human happiness got in the way of a grand, inhuman design. It got crushed. What if he had recovered? What if their escape plan had succeeded? It's a question that hangs over this part of the story, a ghost of a different future. A future where Lucrezia Borgia was not defined by her family's crimes, but by her own courage. It would have been a stunning victory, a triumph of love over brutal political calculus. For a few precious weeks this possibility felt real. It felt attainable. Alfonso was healing. Her fortress was holding. But while Lucrezia measured her life in doses of medicine and small signs of recovery, her brother was measuring his in days on a military calendar. His new French allies were waiting. His campaign to conquer the Romagna was scheduled to begin, and the political embarrassment of his failed assassination attempt was still alive, breathing, and recovering in his sister's care, right under his father's roof. While she was fighting for one man's life, Cesare was finalizing plans that would extinguish thousands. The patience of a man like Cesare Borgia is not infinite. It is a strategic resource, and he was about to decide it had run out. It was the 18th of August, 33 days after the attack on the steps of St. Peter's. A fragile, exhausted sense of victory had settled inside the sick room. Alfonso of Aragon was sitting up in bed, propped by pillows, able to take broth from a spoon. His fever had broken for good, and though he was terribly weak, the physicians now spoke of recovery in terms of weeks, not miracles. Lucrezia, watching him, might have allowed herself to believe she had actually won. She had held the line against the most powerful man in Italy, but that belief was the final, most cruel illusion of her brief marriage. Her victory was merely a delay, a pause her brother had permitted before delivering his final move. The game was not over. Its most brutal phase was just about to begin. The end did not arrive with a crash of swords or a shouted warning. It came with a sound that was far more terrifying in its civility, a firm, deliberate knock upon the chamber door. It was not the sound of a servant seeking entry. It was the sound of an authority that did not expect to be denied. Lucrezia lightly froze, her hand halfway to her husband's lips with a spoonful of soup. Her guards, the men she had handpicked, would have shifted nervously outside, their loyalty suddenly tested by a power greater than hers. One of them would have opened the door a crack, only to find himself looking into a face that was legendarily devoid of emotion. The man standing in the doorway was Michelotto Corella. He was not a nobleman, nor a courtier. He was something older and more essential to the Borgia enterprise. He was Cesare's chief enforcer, his captain general, a man whose absolute loyalty was matched only by his chilling efficiency. He was the family's final solution to any problem, the quiet professional who tidied up their messes with a cord or a blade. His very presence in that hallway was a death sentence. To see him there was to understand that the time for politics and persuasion was over. Michelotto did not force his way in. He simply walked into the room, his men filing in behind him, their armor making a soft, rhythmic clinking that was the only sound in the suddenly silent space. They moved with a placid confidence, displacing the air, making the room feel smaller, trapping the light from the windows. Lucrezia and Alfonso's sister, Cesare of Aragon, who was also in the room, rose to their feet. The two women instinctively placed themselves between the intruders and Alfonso's bed, forming a desperate human barricade. Lucrezia's voice, when she found it, was likely sharp, with a fear she refused to let become panic. She demanded to know his purpose. Here, let us try to see this moment through Michelotto's eyes. He would not have registered the fear or the anger on the women's faces as an emotional event. It was simply data, an obstacle to be managed before the true work could begin. He was not there to negotiate or to explain. He was there to carry out an order from his master, an order as absolute and unquestionable as a law of nature. For him, this was not a bedroom, and Alfonso was not a man. This was a theatre of operations, and Alfonso was a target. The love and terror filling the room were irrelevant variables in a simple mechanical equation. His reply was brief and his voice was flat. The women were to leave the room at once. The order was not a request. Lucrezia, who had stood down her own brother, would not have yielded so easily. She would have refused, her voice rising, reminding him that this was her husband, that this was the apostolic palace, that she was the Pope's daughter. Cesare would have joined her, their protests filling the small space, a frantic counterpoint to the men's disciplined silence. But their rank, their titles, meant nothing in this moment. The only authority that mattered now was the one Michelotto represented, the authority of Cesare's will. He would have given a subtle nod. Two of his men would have stepped forward, their movements economical and without malice. They took the duchesses by their arms. This was the true turning point, the moment when the last pretense of civility was stripped away. Lucrezia was no longer the Pope's beloved daughter to be placated. She was an impediment. She and Cesare were physically escorted from the room, their struggles useless against the practiced strength of the soldiers. Their cries would have been desperate, pleading, a torrent of names. Alfonso's, her father's, perhaps even God's. And then came the sound that would haunt Lucrezia for the rest of her life. The heavy oak door was pulled shut, its iron latch falling into place with a solid, definitive thud. The sound cut off her screams, leaving her in the antechamber with only their dying echo. She was outside, helpless. Her husband was inside, with the executioner. The fortress she had so carefully built for more than a month had been breached and captured in less than a minute. All she could do now was press her ear against the thick wood, listening. For a few seconds there was silence. Then, from within the room, came a sound. It was not a scream. Alfonso was too weak for that. It was a series of low, muffled noises, the sound of a desperate, feeble struggle. She would have heard the sharp creak of the bed frame as weight shifted violently upon it. She might have heard a soft thump, as if something had been overturned. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. There was only silence. A deep, profound, and absolute silence from beyond the door, a quiet so complete it felt louder than any scream. It was the sound of a life being extinguished. Inside, Michelotto's work was finished. It would have been quick. His method of choice was the garrote, a cord looped around the neck and twisted with a stick. It was silent, it left little mess, and it was certain. He would have approached the bed where the recovering duke lay, seeing not a young man who had almost survived, but an assignment that had been left incomplete. There was no rage in his actions, no passion. It was the dispassionate work of a craftsman finishing a task. He would have checked to ensure it was done, then turned and walked back toward the door, his duty fulfilled. He was not a murderer. He was a servant, When the door opened again, Michelotto stepped out into the antechamber, his face as impassive as when he had entered. He did not look at the two women crumpled on the floor. He simply gave a signal to his men, and they filed out behind him, their footsteps receding down the long marble corridor until they were gone. They had appeared like ghosts, and they vanished in the same way, leaving behind a devastation that was all too real. Lucrezia and Sanchia scrambled back into the room. The scene was still, almost peaceful, except for one terrible detail. Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, the 17-year-old husband and father, lay dead in his bed, his head at an unnatural angle against the pillows. His slow, painful 33-day recovery had been erased in 33 seconds. The brother had finished what his assassins had started. He had reclaimed his sister by making her a widow. But this is where the story takes its final chilling turn. This was not simply a murder. It was the beginning of a lie, an official narrative constructed with the same cold precision as the murder itself. Within hours, the Vatican's scribes were at work. The official announcement, sent to the courts of Italy, did not speak of armed men or a visit from Cesare's captain. It reported that the Duke of Bisceglie, while recovering from the lamentable attack a month prior, had suffered a sudden and tragic relapse. The official cause of death was a hemorrhage from his old shoulder wound, brought on by a violent fever. They murdered him in secret, and then announced his death as a medical misfortune. This changes everything, because it demonstrates a new level of impunity. They did not just believe they could kill anyone they wished. They believed they could rewrite reality itself. The silence that fell over the Borgia apartments was not a peaceful one. It was a thick, suffocating blanket, a void where a life had just been. This quiet lasted only for a short time before it was replaced by a different set of sounds, the sounds of power reasserting itself over truth. You would have heard the scratch of a quill pen on heavy parchment, moving with urgent speed in a secretarial office deep within the palace. The words it formed were carefully chosen, designed to be smooth, plausible, and utterly false. That single piece of paper was the first weapon deployed in the new war, the war for the official story. Couriers were summoned, their boots echoing on the marble floors as they received their sealed instructions. They would ride out from the Vatican that very night, carrying the Borgia version of events to the courts of Italy and beyond. They were disseminating a fiction, a story of a tragic medical accident, a sudden turn for the worse in a promising recovery. But every ambassador who would read that dispatch, every rival prince and wary cardinal, would understand the unspoken message hidden between the lines of elegant Latin. They would know it was a lie, and more importantly, they would know they were expected to accept it as truth. This acceptance was the true measure of Borgia power. It was not enough to commit a murder. One had to have the authority to rename it a tragedy. Cesare Borgia did not hide. He did not flee the scene or feign ignorance. That was the method for lesser men. Instead, he sought out his father, not as a penitent son, but as a field commander delivering an after-action report. The conversation that took place between them, likely in the Pope's private study, was almost certainly devoid of moral debate. Cesare would have presented his actions as a logical, if regrettable, necessity. He would have laid out the strategic case with the cold clarity of a master strategist. Alfonso, he would have argued, was a foreign agent in their midst, a symbol of a broken alliance that threatened their new and vital pact with France. His continued survival was a political contagion, spreading dissent and reminding their enemies of a time when the Borgias were weaker. He might have gone further, claiming to have intercepted letters, to have uncovered a plot by Alfonso to open Rome's gates to a Neapolitan army. There is no historical evidence for any such plot. It was almost certainly a fabrication, a justification created after the fact, but it was the kind of argument that Alexander could understand, and more importantly, use. It transformed a sordid family murder into an act of state security, a necessary execution to protect the papacy itself from treason. Cesare was not admitting to a crime. He was claiming credit for neutralizing a threat. He was offering his father not a confession to absolve, but a political narrative to adopt. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that his father would take it. What does a man do when he is both a father and a king, and the duties of one demand the ruin of the other? We must try to stand in Pope Alexander's shoes in that moment, in the hours after he was told that his daughter's husband had been strangled in a bed just one floor above his own. His first public reaction was a masterful performance of paternal grief and holy outrage. He was seen weeping. He ordered the papal court into official mourning and commanded that masses be said for the soul of his dear, departed son-in-law. To the outside world, he was a heartbroken old man, shocked by the cruelty of fate that had snatched the young duke from the jaws of recovery. He played the part of the pontiff, the supreme moral authority of Christendom, decrying the violence that had first wounded the duke. He renewed his calls for the sham investigation to find the culprits of the original attack, knowing full well the man responsible was his own son. It was a magnificent, hollow spectacle. He used the rituals and symbols of his sacred office to create a smokescreen to hide a brutal truth behind a veil of public piety. But every prayer he uttered for Alfonso's soul was a stone laid on the wall of the cover-up, making it higher, thicker, and more impenetrable. But here's where it gets complicated. To dismiss Alexander's actions as pure, monstrous cynicism is to miss the terrifying logic that guided him. This was not just about protecting a favorite son from the consequences of his temper. It was about protecting the entire Borgia enterprise, a project he believed was greater and more important than any single life, including the happiness of his own daughter. His complicity was not a moment of weakness. It was a calculated decision, a choice made at a crossroads where the paths of father and sovereign diverged forever. He chose to be a sovereign. Imagine the political storm that a real investigation would have unleashed. To accuse Cesare, the captain general of the church and the newly minted Duke of Valentinois, would be to admit that the Pope's own family was a nest of assassins. It would have shattered the brand new, and absolutely critical, alliance with France. The French king had not invested troops and a royal bride in Cesare only to see him tried for the murder of a Neapolitan prince. An open accusation would have been seen as a betrayal by the French and an open invitation to attack by the Spanish and their Neapolitan allies. It would have plunged the Papal States, and perhaps all of Italy, into a devastating war, a war the Borgias might not win. The great project, the forging of a hereditary kingdom for his son, would have died before it truly began. So, Alexander made his choice. He sacrificed his daughter's husband on the altar of his son's ambition. Justice for Alfonso would have meant the end of everything they had built. A cover-up, however, cost him nothing but a piece of his soul, a currency he had learned to spend quite freely. He chose the family. He chose the grand design. In his mind, it seems he balanced the grief of one daughter against the glorious destiny of his son, and found her sorrow to be the lighter weight. The stability of their dynasty was the greater good, and any action taken to preserve it, no matter how cruel, was therefore justified. It is the timeless, terrifying logic of the tyrant, where the preservation of power becomes the highest moral imperative. And so, the official investigation into the first attack was quietly and permanently halted. The official cause of death was entered into the Vatican's records. The story was set in stone. In the days that followed, a new and deeper quiet descended upon Rome. It was the silence of fear. Ambassadors wrote their dispatches home in carefully coded language. Cardinals who had once been openly pro-Neapolitan suddenly fell silent in consistory meetings, their gazes fixed on the floor. Everyone understood what had happened, and everyone understood that to speak the truth aloud would be to invite a similar fate. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon inside the Apostolic Palace was not just the removal of a political obstacle. It was the ultimate demonstration of Borgia impunity. It sent a clear and chilling message to the world. There is no sanctuary. There is no law higher than our will. We can kill a man under the Pope's own roof, in his daughter's bed, and we will then use the Pope's own authority to sanctify the act. The line between the sacred and the profane had not just been crossed, it had been erased. The papacy was now openly an instrument of a criminal dynasty, and God's house was a place where God's laws no longer applied if they interfered with the family's business. This act cemented Cesare's reputation. He was no longer just a brilliant and ambitious upstart. He was a man who operated entirely without restraint, a force of nature whose will was absolute. fear is a more reliable instrument of power than love or loyalty, and after the death of Alfonso, Cesare was the most feared man in Italy. His enemies now knew there was no line he would not cross, and his allies knew there was no price he would not pay to achieve his goals. The murder served its purpose. It cleared the board for his new French alliance and his campaigns in the Romagna. Strategically, it was a stunning success, but it left a poison in the heart of the family itself. The perfect trinity of the Pope, the general, and the bride was now broken. They had achieved a new level of power, but they had done so by brutalizing one of their own. This single act of cold-blooded familial cruelty would come to define their entire legacy, overshadowing all their political achievements and artistic patronage. It is the story that has echoed through the centuries, the act that confirmed the darkest rumors about them. It revealed the truth of their family bond. It was not a bond of affection, but a chain of command. And it leaves us with the most troubling question of all, a question that goes beyond mere political calculation. We can understand, in a cold, strategic sense, why Cesare wanted Alfonso dead. We can even understand why Alexander the Prince chose to protect his state and his dynasty. But he was also a father. He had held his daughter Lucrezia as a baby, had overseen her education, and had, by all accounts, adored her above all his other children. He had just watched his son orchestrate a plan that would deliberately and permanently shatter her heart and her life, all for political gain. Why would a father be so utterly complicit in his son's monstrous cruelty toward his beloved daughter? The answer reveals something deeply unsettling about the true priorities of this family, a darkness that politics alone cannot explain. The official story was a masterpiece of cold-blooded fiction, but inside Lucrezia's chambers, a different kind of silence reigned. It was not the quiet of peace, but the airless vacuum left behind when a life is stolen. For 2 days, she did not speak, she did not eat. She sat in a chair, shrouded in black, looking at the bed where her husband had died. The world outside continued its sacred jubilee rhythm. The chants of pilgrims and the ringing of church bells still drifted through her windows, but they sounded alien now, sounds from a world to which she no longer belonged. Her grief was a thing of terrible stillness. It was a physical weight, pressing down on her, making each breath a conscious effort. Every object in the room was a torment. A book of poetry they had read together, a lute he had played, the small cradle of their son, Rodrigo. These were not just memories. They were shards of a life that had been deliberately shattered. The profound betrayal was a poison that worked its way deeper than any sorrow. It was not fate or sickness that had taken him. It was a command given by her brother and sanctioned by her father. The two men she had been raised to love and obey were the architects of her desolation. Her ladies-in-waiting would have moved around her like ghosts, whispering, unsure of what to do. They would have offered her food she would not touch, and words of comfort she could not hear. Her only point of contact with the living world was her son. We can only guess at the complex storm of emotions she felt looking at him. He had his father's eyes. He was the living legacy of a love that had cost her everything. He was also a Borgia, a grandson of the Pope who had allowed his father's murder. That child was both a comfort and a curse, a reason to live and a constant reminder of the dead. Eventually, her brother came to her. Cesare did not arrive with apologies or condolences. He came as a commander, inspecting a battlefield after the fighting was done, assessing the damage and issuing new orders. Imagine yourself in that room for a moment. The air is thick with unspoken accusation. Lucrezia, pale and hollowed by grief, finally looks at him. Her gaze would not have been filled with tears, but with a cold, clear and absolute knowledge. She knew what he was, what he had done, and that the brother she had known, or thought she had known, was gone forever. He did not confess. Men like Cesare never confess, they instruct. He likely explained his actions with that unnerving calm of his, framing the murder not as a personal cruelty, but as a political necessity. He might have spoken of state security, of the French alliance, of the great future of their house. He was explaining the logic of the machine, a machine in which her happiness was a faulty part that had to be replaced. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was demanding her understanding, her compliance. He was telling her that her duty to the family was not finished. It was simply entering a new, more painful phase. She had to accept this. She had to accept that her husband's life was less important than his own ambition. This is a dynamic that is tragically familiar, even today. In some family systems, loyalty is not a reciprocal bond. It is a one-way street, a form of absolute obedience demanded by the powerful. The abuser justifies their cruelty as being for the good of the family, reframing their victim's pain as a necessary sacrifice for a greater cause. It's a form of psychological control that leaves the victim isolated, convincing them that their own suffering is a form of selfishness, a failure to understand the bigger picture. Lucrezia was being asked to see her own devastation as a contribution to the family's glory. She was being told that her broken heart was a small price to pay for her brother's kingdom. Her response was not the explosive rage he might have expected. Her grief had burned past that, leaving something harder and colder in its place. She said very little, but her silence was its own form of rebellion. It was a refusal to participate in his fiction. She would not grant him the absolution of her understanding. She would not play her part in the family drama any longer. Her quiet was a wall he could not breach, and for a man used to absolute control, this passive resistance must have been infuriating. He could kill her husband, but he could not command her to approve of it. This silent defiance was a problem. A publicly grieving widow in the Vatican, the very symbol of his cruelty, was a political liability. Her sorrow was an open wound on the face of their triumph. It contradicted the official story and kept the memory of the crime alive. So, Cesare made another calculated decision. He told her she was to leave Rome. He framed it as a kindness, a chance for her to mourn in private, away from the pressures of the papal court. She was to travel to the town of Nepi, a fortified castle about 30 miles north of the city. He told her it was for her own good, but it was not a suggestion. It was an exile. A gilded one, to be sure, but an exile nonetheless. She was being removed from the board, sent away so that the business of power could continue without the inconvenient spectacle of her grief. He was banishing the evidence of his crime. By sending her away, he could control the narrative completely. The story would be that the Pope's devoted daughter, overcome with sorrow, had retired to the countryside to recover her health. It was a lie, just like the story of Alfonso's death, but it was a lie that served the family's purpose. Let us try to see that departure. A carriage, draped in black, waiting in a quiet Vatican courtyard in the pre-dawn light. The sounds would be muted, the soft creak of the leather harnesses, the nervous stomp of a horse, the low, respectful murmurs of the servants. Lucrezia would emerge, cloaked and veiled, a shadow moving through the palace that was her home and her prison. She would be holding her young son, her one connection to the life that had been destroyed. She was 20 years old, and she was leaving the only world she had ever known, cast out by the family she had been forced to serve. Imagine the journey for a moment. As the carriage rumbled over the cobblestones and out of the city gates, every landmark would be a fresh wound. There, the church where she and Alfonso had prayed. There, the piazza, where they had watched a festival. There, the bridge they had crossed on evening rides. The city of her birth was now a museum of her pain, and she was being forcibly escorted away from the scene of the crime. She knew who had done this. She knew she was powerless to seek justice, and she knew she was still, inextricably, a Borgia, her life and fortune tied to the very people who had ruined her. What does that silence inside the carriage feel like? Is it pure grief, a bottomless well of sorrow? Is it fear for her own future, for the future of her son? Or is there something else there, beneath the layers of pain? A cold, simmering anger, a nascent resolve, the kind of strength that is only forged when everything you have has been taken from you. She was leaving Rome as a victim. It is easy to wonder if she was already, unconsciously, planning to one day return as something else entirely. The castle at Nepi was grim and ancient, a military fortress, not a noble court. Its thick stone walls would have felt like the walls of a tomb. The rooms were dark and cold, even in the late summer. It was a place of isolation, a place to be forgotten, and for a time she was. The official dispatches from the Vatican ceased to mention her. To the outside world, Lucrezia Borgia had simply disappeared, but inside those fortress walls, a profound internal change was taking place. The first stage was a collapse. A letter she wrote to her father during this time survives. It is filled with a raw, almost incoherent despair. She speaks of her continuous weeping and bitter suffering. She begs him to remember that she is his daughter. It is the cry of a child who cannot understand how her own parent could have participated in her destruction. But sorrow, when it is deep enough, eventually burns itself out. What is left behind is a kind of clarity. In the solitude of Nepi, away from the suffocating influence of her father and brother for the first time in her life, Lucrezia had nothing but time to think. She had seen the ultimate truth of her family. She understood that their love was conditional, their protection a form of control. She had been their most prized possession, and when her own happiness conflicted with their plans, they had not hesitated to destroy it. She had learned the most important lesson of her life. In the world of the Borgias, she could rely on no one but herself. The girl who had entered Nepi, the weeping, heartbroken widow, did not stay that way for long. The letters she began to write took on a new tone. They were less emotional, more pragmatic. She started to take an active interest in the governance of the town. She issued edicts, she settled disputes, she managed finances. It was as if, having lost her personal world, she decided to master the public one. She was no longer just reacting to the moves her family made. She was beginning to learn how to play the game herself, on her own terms. This period of exile was her crucible. It burned away the last of her youthful innocence, her belief in the safety of her family. It forced her to confront the reality that she was alone. The power she had always possessed by virtue of her name was an illusion. It could be given and taken away at her brother's whim. If she was to survive, if she was to protect her son, she would need to cultivate a different kind of power, one that came from within. The obedient daughter was dying. A new woman was being born in the cold stone halls of that lonely castle. A woman shaped by grief, hardened by betrayal, and perhaps for the first time, truly free. Her brother had sent her away to neutralize her. He thought that by isolating her, he could break her will and force her back into her designated role. It seems he miscalculated. He had intended to create a docile, compliant widow, a tragic figure who would eventually be recycled into another political marriage when the time was right. But he had inadvertently given her the one thing she had never had before: space. Space to heal, space to think, and space to grow into something he could no longer completely control. The question that remained, hanging in the air between Rome and Nepi, was what she would do with this newfound strength. Would she ever be able to face her brother again? And if she did, who would she be when that day finally came? While Lucrezia Borgia learned to govern within the cold stone confines of Nepi, the story of her husband's death began a journey of its own. It did not stay locked behind the Vatican's bronze doors. It seeped out, carried in the coded dispatches of ambassadors, whispered from cardinal to secretary, and passed between merchants on the road. The official narrative of a tragic illness was a flimsy dam against a flood of rumor, and as this story traveled, it transformed. It gathered detail, it acquired motive, it took on a symbolic weight far heavier than the truth itself. The murder of one young man was becoming something else entirely, something far more powerful. It was becoming the cornerstone of a legend. This was the birth of what historians now call the Black Legend of the Borgias. It was not a single book or a formal accusation, but a vast and powerful smear campaign, a tapestry of accusations woven by their countless enemies over decades. It depicted the family as something beyond mere political corruption. It portrayed them as monsters, a dynasty of devils who practiced incest, who delighted in poison, and who presided over a papal court that was a new Sodom. This legend was a weapon, a form of political warfare designed to delegitimize their power and cast them out of the community of Christian rulers. And like all effective propaganda, it was built around a core of indisputable, shocking truth. The strangling of Alfonso of Aragon, inside the Pope's own home, was that core. The crime was the perfect anchor for every dark accusation their enemies wanted to make. Let's explore the elements that made it so uniquely potent. First, there was the sheer audacity of the location. To commit a murder is one thing. To do so within the Apostolic Palace, the supposed spiritual center of the Western world, was an act of breathtaking sacrilege. It suggested that for the Borgias, nothing was sacred. It broadcast a terrifying message that their worldly power superseded even their holy office. They had not just broken a law of man, they had demonstrated a profound contempt for the law of God in his own house. Then there was the identity of the victim. Alfonso was not a political rival to be disposed of in the usual manner. He was family. He was the Pope's son-in-law and the brother-in-law of his killer. This fact struck a deeper, more primal chord of horror. It suggested a corruption that went beyond politics, into the very nature of their humanity. It painted them as a clan so pathologically self-interested that even the most fundamental bonds of kinship were meaningless next to their ambition. What kind of men, their enemies asked, would so coldly sacrifice their own daughters' and sisters' happiness for a shift in strategy? The murder allowed them to be portrayed as unnatural, a family whose inner workings were a dark perversion of a normal home. The combination of motives made the story irresistible. It was not a simple crime of passion, nor was it a purely rational act of state. It was both, and that is what made it so chilling. The cold, strategic logic of the French alliance was something other rulers could understand, even if they condemned it. But when fused with the whispers of Cesare's obsessive, jealous attachment to his sister, the act took on a far more sinister character. It spoke of a man whose brilliant political mind was inseparable from a monstrously possessive soul. This duality was terrifying. It meant he was not just a ruthless politician you could negotiate with. He was an unpredictable force, driven by desires that operated outside the normal rules of human interaction. Finally, the brazen nature of the cover-up was almost as shocking as the murder itself. The official story of a medical relapse was an insult to the intelligence of every court in Europe. By forcing everyone to accept a lie they knew to be a lie, the Borgias were performing an act of dominance. It was a demonstration of their power not just to kill, but to control reality itself. They were declaring that truth was whatever they said it was, and that the rest of the world had no choice but to nod in agreement. This ultimate act of arrogance confirmed what their enemies had been saying all along, that the Borgias believed themselves to be above judgment, both on earth and in heaven. These elements were meticulously documented and disseminated by the people who watched them unfold. We have the dispatches of the Venetian ambassador, Paolo Capello, who wrote with undisguised horror of the events, stating plainly that Cesare himself had admitted to the act. We have the diaries of the papal master of ceremonies, Johannes Burchard, a man who recorded the daily life of the Vatican with a meticulous and often damning neutrality. His clinical, unemotional account of the official mourning, set against the rumors he also recorded, creates a portrait of breathtaking hypocrisy. These were not histories written 50 years later. They were eyewitness accounts, the first rough drafts of the legend, sent out from Rome while Alfonso's body was still warm. These reports created a feedback loop of fear and fascination. The more audacious the Borgias became, the more their enemies chronicled their deeds. The more their deeds were chronicled, the more their reputation for monstrousness grew. The murder cemented the family brand. The name Borgia became international shorthand for a new type of power, one that was seductive, intelligent, secular, and utterly ruthless. They became symbols of the age itself, an era of dazzling artistic achievement and profound moral decay. They were the darkness that gave the Renaissance light its definition. Their story was a cautionary tale, but it was also a thrilling one. For a generation of thinkers trying to understand the changing nature of power, Cesare Borgia became a vital, if terrifying, case study. The most famous of these was a Florentine diplomat named Niccolò Machiavelli. He saw in Cesare not a monster, but a model of the new prince, a man who understood that in a world of wolves, a ruler could not afford to be a lamb. Machiavelli admired Cesare's use of calculated cruelty, his understanding that fear was a more reliable tool than love, and his willingness to do whatever was necessary to build and maintain a state. The murder of Alfonso, in Machiavelli's cold calculus, was not a sin. It was a textbook example of removing a political liability decisively. He was less interested in the morality of the act than in its effectiveness. Cesare's reputation, built on acts just like this one, became a tool of statecraft, a weapon that conquered cities before his armies even arrived. The legend, however, required more than just a male villain. It also needed a female one, and so, the story that spread across Europe began to subtly alter Lucrezia's role in the tragedy. She was no longer depicted as the grieving widow and defiant protector. That truth was inconvenient for the narrative. Instead, the Black Legend reimagined her. In this darker version, she was a willing participant in her family's crimes, a seductive honey trap, the smiling face of the Borgia enterprise. Her beauty was recast as a dangerous lure, her intelligence as cunning. The rumors of incest were used to paint her as a woman of depraved appetites, complicit in her brother's darkest desires. Her marriage to Alfonso, and its violent end, were twisted into a story of her own fickle and deadly nature. It was easier for their enemies to portray her as a femme fatale than as a victim. A victim would imply the Borgias preyed upon the innocent, a truth which might generate sympathy, but a villainess confirmed that the entire family was rotten to the core. So the story was told that she tired of Alfonso, or that she was a willing accomplice in her brother's plot, clearing the way for her next strategic marriage. Her real grief, her exile, her quiet defiance, these complicated truths were erased from the popular version of the story. They were replaced by a caricature that was simpler, more lurid, and ultimately more useful to her family's enemies. This transformation of Lucrezia from victim to villainess is perhaps the legend's most enduring cruelty. It stripped her of her agency and her humanity, turning her into a two-dimensional symbol of female wickedness. For centuries, this was the Lucrezia that history remembered. The woman of letters, the capable administrator, the patron of the arts. This person was buried beneath the weight of the slander. She became a footnote in her brother's monstrous story, her life defined not by her own actions, but by the crimes committed against her and in her name. And so, the legacy was forged. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon was the spark that lit a fire of condemnation that would burn for centuries. It became the central exhibit in the case against the Borgia papacy. It gave their political rivals the moral high ground. It gave preachers a sermon on the corruption of the church. And it gave storytellers a tale of ambition, jealousy, and murder so perfectly dramatic it seemed to have been crafted by a playwright. The story had everything: a sacred setting, a handsome young prince, a beautiful princess, and a villain of magnificent, calculating evil. It was a story that would echo through the works of Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas, and would eventually become a staple of film and television. The Borgias became mythological figures, their historical reality almost completely consumed by the legend they inspired. They are remembered not for unifying the papal states, or for being patrons of Pinturicchio and Michelangelo, but for this single, brutal act of familial violence. The strangling of Alfonso was the moment they ceased to be merely a historical family and became a permanent archetype. They became a timeless fable about how the bonds of family can become chains, and how the pursuit of absolute power requires the absolute destruction of love. This is the great and terrible power of a single, well-told story. It can become more real than the people who lived it. It can flatten complex human beings into simple symbols, their inner lives and private sorrows lost in the glare of their public sins. The Black Legend gave the world a simple verdict on the Borgias. It declared them guilty, and the murder of Alfonso was the first and most important charge on the indictment. But a legend, by its very nature, simplifies. It leaves no room for ambiguity, for grief, or for the possibility of change. It provides answers, but it rarely asks the most important human questions. As we stand now, looking back across 500 years of their dark fame, we are left to wonder. We see the myth, powerful and enduring, but can we still find the people who are trapped inside of it?